TIL Atari programmers met with Atari CEO Ray Kassar in May 1979 to demand that the company treat developers as record labels treated musicians, with royalties and their names on game boxes. Kassar said no and that anyone can do a cartridge. So the programmers left Atari and founded Activision. Does Activision treat their programmers like musicians and put their names on the box? Activision's business model was, obviously, more sustainable than Atari's. A game at the time was usually made by just 1 or 2 people. Activision had less than 10 employees for their first 10 years. Most of their employees worked on getting distribution. But their model worked better because they could port to all of the consoles. When Nintendo came out and put a nail in Atari's coffin, Activision could just port to the Nintendo. And now Activision is one of the greediest companies in the world that rather fire half their employees than lower the CEO's salary for a few months like Nintendo did. EA, Electronic Arts at that time, took it one step further. Not only did they treat their programmers like musicians, they released the games to look like folding album jackets, complete with photos and such inside. Inside of the jacket for M.U.L.E. https://www. filfra. net/wp content/upload/2013/02/mule_package 04. This reminds me that years ago I was a programmer when computer programming was a relatively new field. I saw ads in the paper for programmers at much higher salary than I was earning at the time. I showed my supervisor those ads and asked if maybe the company could increase my salary a bit. He took the matter higher up and the answer came back no, so I applied to one of those jobs in the ads and got accepted at an appreciably higher salary. When I gave my notice, the managers met and called me in a couple of hours later and offered to match the salary I was offered plus a little more if I would stay on. That kinda infuriated me internally and I told them that I intended to keep my commitment to the new company and I left. And then Activision treated their employees even worse lol. Then, in the early 90s, Sony treated their programmers like rock stars. When they started hiring they expanded Sony Music as it was just an experiment, and they got shafted by Nintendo. So the people dealing with devs had lifelong careers in dealing with artists. And now Activision is just as shitty as Atari ever was. Amazing. Who has the last laugh now? Something nobody points out here, Atari received no money from any game made by Activision at the start. They sold consoles at a loss to get people to buy the games at a profit. The problem is, there was nothing blocking someone from putting in a third-party game. All games back then were first-party. Activision was the first third-party game company. Atari sued them to stop, but only got royalties. The problem was, everyone from porn studios to Quaker Oats made Atari games with Atari seeing none of the profit. Tie that in with the absolutely abysmal $5,200, paying a guy to make Pac-Man up front in 6 weeks, e.t., and the failure of the $7,800, the company went bankrupt. In order to make games for Nintendo, Sony, or Microsoft consoles, you have to pay them royalties, which varies, but is around 10%. This is because cartridge games post-NES had a lockout chip, and disc games won't work without code from the company. IRC some consoles post-internet connectivity actually have a list of title codes in the system and will only run them if the title matches. Nintendo was the only company who made the chips for the NES, although some third parties were allowed due to how big their companies were, basically NES-era AAA game studios. The pitfalls of working with creative types. Is that why Activision is such a piece of shit today? Just curious. TIL Activision has been around since 1979. Something else that's interesting is that they called their new company Activision in part so that they would appear before Atari on alphabetical lists. Acclaim Entertainment would later do the same thing when they were created by a group who split from Activision. Funny how all these companies get founded by people who want things to be better, or want to explore what they want to explore, but they all end up as corporate trash heaps in the end. And now they are one of the worst things to happen in gaming history. Great. EA similarly emphasized its early games as creations by named designers and devs, and were inspired by the United Artists, https://en. Wikipedia, org/wiki/united_artists, film studio. Founded and incorporated on May 27, 1982, by Apple, https://en. Wikipedia, org/wiki/apple_inc. Employee Trip Hawkins, https://en. Wikipedia, org/wiki/trip_Hawkins. The company was a pioneer of the early home computer, https://en. Wikipedia, org/wiki/home_computer, * games industry, and was notable for promoting the designers and programmers responsible for its games. When Gordon and others pushed for electronic artists, in tribute to the film company United Artists, https://en. Wikipedia, org/wiki/united_artists, *, Steve Hayes opposed, saying, "We're not the artists, they /the developers /are." This statement from Hayes immediately tilted sentiment towards electronic arts, and the name was unanimously endorsed and adopted later in 1982. \13 https://en. Wikipedia, org/wiki/electronic_arts #site_note EA early history 13. https://en. Wikipedia, org/wiki/electronic_arts, https://en. Wikipedia, org/wiki/electronic_arts. I remember when Activision games started coming out for the Atari. They were hot and seemed on a whole nother level in terms of graphics and sounds. And then Activision went bankrupt and almost everyone was fired. It wasn't until they restructured and moved to LA that they became successful again. This is also the trigger that started the 1983 video game crash. Atari sued Activision the moment they formed, because of one simple reason: Atari didn't produce the cartridges for themselves, they went through an independent supplier. As such, anyone, including Activision, could purchase them in bulk and publish games on them, without a need for royalties. This sent Atari into panic mode, because Atari was losing money on the 2600, and were dependent on the games they produced to make margins in order to make the console profitable. However, court ruled in 1982 that Activision could perfectly legally sell the games on the system and labeled it fair use, essentially legitimizing the idea of third-party video game developers. None existed before Activision. This opened the floodgates and caused a chain reaction. Multiple third-party developers formed everywhere, both independent and owned by other tech/toy companies looking to make a quick buck, and this turned into an obvious disaster. Retailers simply couldn't stock games anymore. You had multiple consoles on the market, and a molasses flood of games for all of them, filling up inventory. Many of these games ended up in bargain bins and essentially forgotten. Activision was still allowed to sell their games during the court case and had a head start to build their name, which allowed them to survive the crash, but there was a mass of other video game titles on the market, and in the pre-internet era, there was no way to differentiate bad or good ones, creating a market with the only review being by word of mouth. Game magazines existed, but even they couldn't keep up with the massive influx of games. And such, the market crashed in 1983. Many retailers refused to hold video games or consoles in stores. Many of the newly formed developers collapsed under the market saturation, and video games were nearly stigmatized. Enter Nintendo. Nintendo was already planning to release the Famicom in the US as early as 1983, planning a joint venture with Atari to introduce the Famicom. However, Nintendo got cold feet once they saw the effects, and went back to the drawing board, and deployed a very elaborate strategy to ensure they wouldn't be a victim of the crash. Nintendo established their own cartridge manufacturing business in the US, and developed a fail-safe, a chip called 10NES. This chip served as sort of a key for the console. that had to be scanned by the console to boot the game. This allowed Nintendo to ensure they can be the sole supplier of video game cartridges for the system, as the chip was impossible to crack. They imposed a very draconian deal for all the remaining third-party developers. All licensees couldn't produce more than 5 games for RHE system annually, all games had to be exclusive for the console for at least 2 years, and all cartridges had to be purchased directly from Nintendo with a minimum of 10,000 cartridges. They also had strict guidelines on what was allowed and disallowed in the games: blood, gore and sexual content. The Famicom was completely redesigned to look like a VCR, and named Nintendo Entertainment System. Everything video game related was essentially a stigma, and they had to carefully avoid any association with video games directly. In order to better promote the NES as a toy rather than a console, they bundled the NES with R.O.B. the robot, to give it an appearance of an elaborate children's toy, and it worked like a charm. It was soft-launched in 1985 and officially launched in 1987. However, their regulations would bite them in the ass 10 years later, but that's another story.